Hello, and welcome everybody to another episode of Strick and Roll. I'm your host, Shwin, and this is episode 64. I'm joined by the host of Post on Minnesota. Is it Locked on Minnesota? Locked on Minnesota
Locked on
post game
Minnesota.
streams. He is a fan of the greatest football team in the entire world, the Minnesota Vikings. You know him formerly as the editor-in-chief of Canis Hoopus. He has been on this podcast before. His name is Jack Borman. You can follow him on Twitter/X at JRBorman13. Jack, how you doing?
I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm great. It's been a pretty uneventful, last 5, 6, 7 days for us. So we're here to just talk about how uneventful those days were. But before we do that, I do have to make a few announcements. First, we have the Strickland has an Instagram. Check that out. That is at the Strickland Instagram. We are posting all kinds of new content out there. The Strickland also has a YouTube channel where you may be watching this podcast. If you are and have not done so already, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, leave us a comment. That'd be a huge help to us. The Strickland also has merchandise, which you can find on our website at www.thestrick.land. There's a link that'll take you to the merchandise store. You can find all kinds of cool stuff on there, like t-shirts, sweatshirts, hats, coffee mugs, water bottles, you name it. We've got it. Strickland has a Patreon, which you can subscribe to. There are a number of different tiers. There's a $6 tier that gets you access to Pod Strickland, the podcast that I host every Friday at the Prez. You also get access to Takes from Obvious Bozos, a podcast hosted by Andrew Steele, a.k.a. Doug, along with Zach Blatter. And you get access to the Strickland Discord, where the conversation never stops. There are further tiers. There's a $9 tier that gets you access to Strick and Roll, this pod, my solo pod, where I rant and write about the Knicks team more. You also get access to wonderful premium articles by Matthew Miranda, one of the best in the business. And you get access to Strickland NFL, which, you guessed it, is about the NFL that is hosted by Konstantin Metrikos and Desmond Novak. There are further tiers. There's a $15 tier, $30 tier, $50 tier, and a $100 tier. Those come with a variety of additional benefits, like listening on pod recordings, merchandise discounts, and even potentially hosting a podcast alongside yours truly one day, whether you choose to subscribe or not. None of this would be possible without you, and none of this would be possible without BetOnline. BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform, your number one source for everything football. BetOnline has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads to bet on during the games. Think you know your stuff? Get in on our $200,000 mega contest and pick 5 games against the spread every week for your chance at weekly prizes and a share of $200,000. When the game's over, head on over to our online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind with one of our over 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. BetOnline, the game starts here. So the Knicks and Minnesota Timberwolves made a trade. Karl-Anthony Towns heading home to New York City, and Julius Randle heading to not home, along with Donte DiVincenzo, which is also not his home, to the Twin Cities, beautiful Twin Cities, Minneapolis, Minnesota. And you guys get the super valuable, extremely valuable Detroit first round pick, which everybody has always acknowledged was the most valuable asset in the entire NBA. Okay, I actually look. I've done several pods about this from the Knicks angle, and we will talk about the Knicks angle. But I would like to talk about the Minnesota angle first. So I think when this trade went down, obviously we were talking, and first we were both like, because the fucking thing comes out like 10. It's like I think it's like 10:13 p.m. on Friday. I'm just like I'm hanging out and watching college football. I'm like, let me just see what Cam Ward looks like. And, I had a couple bets in on Miami because they were down at halftime. I like the odds. So I'm just hanging out, watching my college football. And then you just DM me. I didn't even get I didn't even see the Shams tweet until you DM'd it. You were like, what the fuck?
I think I was just like,
yeah.
with like 15 H's.
But like my initial interpretation of this was I don't like this trade for Minnesota. I think it's a little more nuanced than that, though. I will say, I think this lowers their immediate ceiling as the team is currently constructed. Like, I thought they were a contender. They were obviously a contender last year. I viewed them as a contender going into the season, even though I still thought, like, the offense, not sure about it. I think this lowers their ceiling, but I would be very surprised if this is the state of the roster past the trade deadline. And I think they have a little bit more flexibility to make trades now. And because of that, I'm just going to give it like an incomplete as of now for Minnesota. If you wanted to give it some letter grade based on the return, I would say like, I don't know, a B minus or something. But to me, I just view it as there's still work to be done with this roster to make sense of it all. I think that front court is asking a lot of Chris Finch to keep a lot of different guys happy in a lot of contract years, which I do not envy him in that sense. And then I think Donte is a really, really good get for Minnesota. I just think there needs to be some work done in terms of freeing up a bigger role for him, because I think what he provides is something that the Timberwolves desperately need. So all that being said, like I don't love it if this is actually just like what the roster is past the trade deadline. Then I'm very, very like out on this trade for them. I don't think that's what will happen. I anticipate them making for like another move. I would say if I was Julius Randle, I would be renting, not buying. Um, and Donte could probably buy. I think he could buy. Maybe be a little flexible. He might be moving in a couple years, but I think you have a little home for a while. But yeah, that's where I'm at with it. I don't know how you felt about it, and I also feel like once they did the Gobert trade, I mean, I think we had you on after you guys traded for Gobert, and it was always kind of like the understanding of whenever they kind of if they decide to this isn't good enough or they need to make a pivot, and the money was already, when they made the Gobert trade, we always knew the money thing was going to become an issue at some point.
And that
Um,
was even before the CBA was
right,
ratified.
right. Yeah. And so like once this, I mean, I think we had you on last year and you're like, yeah, like look, something's coming. Like there's no way they can hold on to this roster going into next season. So I think we've kind of always understood that at some point here, Cat was the likely odd man out, all things considered. Not, I don't want to say odd man out. He just was the most viable candidate to get moved. That it happened like at this bizarro time, right on the eve of training camp, is weird, but also maybe like it's probably what forced their hand. I think the report came out from Shams today that the Knicks had made an offer of like it was like Julius and Mitch all summer. That's why I think they were spending the entire summer shopping both those guys. I think they knew that that wasn't enough, and that they needed to try to get different shit to get Minnesota to make a deal. They did not want to include Donte. Donte had to be included because they couldn't get other things that Minnesota wanted, and here we are now. So I don't know. I guess how did you feel about one? I guess the return on Cat, and then two, you know, how Tim Connolly like kind of plays this moving forward.
Yeah, I think my initial reaction was that I just needed to wait a little bit. I think we all want to have these knee jerk reactions to transactions, and I think fans in Minnesota have been no stranger to that, considering the magnitude of some moves that have taken place over the last 18, 24, 36 months. And I think the overwhelming um, I think feeling for me was just that you have to trust Tim Connolly on this, right? I mean, Tim Connolly has done a lot in his short time as the head of the basketball operations department in Minnesota. I think, for me, and you heard Mike Conley say it, right? Like this is a direct quote from Mike Conley. On Monday at Media Day said, quote, "We have all the trust in the world in Tim and what he has been able to do for this team in such a short period of time. From my understanding, they handled it better than any organization has ever handled trading somebody." And I think when someone like Mike Conley, who is as well respected around the league and is as well traveled around the league as he is, says that about somebody, I think it makes you, I guess, more dug in your feeling of why you should trust somebody. And I think, that was kind of the overwhelming thing for me was, all right, like, let's just trust him Connolly and see what he's going to go with. My initial reaction, really raw and cut filtered reaction was like, whoa. I think, I'm not alone in saying that I'm pretty confident that the two of us had heard that, there were louder rumblings about the Knicks and Karl Anthony Towns leading up to Summer League. And some of those conversations ultimately, didn't materialize in the way that they did this last week. And I think, it was a good thing for the Wolves that they kind of slow played it and were able to extract Donte DiVincenzo because DiVincenzo chose the Knicks over the Timberwolves in free agency. Those were the two teams that he was deciding between ultimately in the end. And the Timberwolves front office is ecstatic to be getting Donte DiVincenzo. Definitely one of the better contracts in the league, especially when you consider what he was able to do after the trade deadline last year in a more freed up role. Certainly was huge. But I think, everything else considered, I think that the number one thing that you have to look at with the trade is the financial savings, right? I think Glenn Taylor is still operating as the majority owner of the
The
Timberwolves,
great
and
Glenn Taylor, just a
he's going to
real
be
magnanimous guy.
he's going to be footing the bill for this team in the interim. And I think there's a big difference between being willing to pay the luxury tax and being outwardly and spoken saying you're going to pay the luxury tax, but there's a big difference between that and being willing to foot the bill for an $109 million luxury tax payment, which is what my calculation is roughly of what the Timberwolves would have been paying before the trade, and now it's down to I think just shy of 70 million. So you're saving $40 million just this season, and that's a pretty substantial thing for a team that's in flux like the Timberwolves are. And the more I dug into it, I think I think you're exactly right in that I fully do not expect Julius Randle to be on the Timberwolves. Whether it be past the trade deadline or past even December 15th or January 15th, those different
Yeah,
dates
yeah,
when
yeah.
players become eligible to be moved. And I think the feeling around Julius Randle for me right now kind of is what it was with D'Angelo Russell a couple seasons ago, where you have this player who certainly is not an ideal fit with what you want out of your roster. And I think most teams around the league probably understand that that's the feeling internally, with the team. And Tim Connolly, certainly everyone expected him to move D'Angelo Russell before the season started. And they kind of knew that the writing was on the wall there, like, hey, this isn't a great fit. I think, certainly faced questions of, are you going to trade this guy? Are you going to keep him really for the majority of the season? And slow played it like he slow played this trade over the course of the summer, and ultimately turned D'Angelo Russell into Mike Conley, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and not one, not two, but 3 second-round picks. One of which they used to package to move up and get Leonard Miller, who is a consensus first-round prospect in the draft. I believe, what was it, the 2023 draft? So, I think you ultimately have to trust Tim Connolly in that. I think your grade of an incomplete makes a lot of sense to me, just considering that I think from what we know about Tim Connolly, he's not a guy who's going to make a trade under duress. He's not a guy who's going to negotiate from a position of weakness or negotiate with teams that have leverage against him. And I think the other thing too that, I know Knicks fans may not want to hear, but is certainly something that I think Timberwolves fans were concerned about moving forward is like Karl-Anthony Towns tore his meniscus and got the shortcut surgery. Like he did not do the full meniscus repair. And I don't think his injury was as serious as some, meniscus tears that require the full, the full repair. But even still, like when you take that shortcut surgery, there are certainly, some downstream impacts that, could certainly, have flare-ups with that knee that may cause him to miss a week here or 2 weeks there or something, something like that, especially if Tibbs goes full Tibbs and is going to play him 38, 40, 42 minutes a game down the stretch of the season. So he fared tremendously well in the playoffs and certainly showed no signs of rust and really was strong for extended stretches in the playoffs. But that is also something that you have to keep in mind. And I think the Timberwolves, a question that they were probably asking themselves internally was, are we sure that we are going to get a better deal for Karl next summer, which is kind of when you absolutely have to trade him, just based on all the different financial implications that I'm sure, listeners are well versed in with the second apron and the new CBA. So,
And you have less leverage then too.
correct. Exactly. And that's why I think that's a big part of why, I think the return probably would have been worse next year, because you're also opening up the case of like, oh, maybe his knee doesn't react as well next year as it did right now. And I think, the Timberwolves are probably just in more of a sell high position than they were, or than they would be next year. When there's just a lot of variables that you can't necessarily control for. And Karl played as well as he probably could have in the playoffs, was as healthy as he probably could have been in the playoffs. And, and it's been no secret that the Knicks have been interested in Karl-Anthony Towns for a long time. So, and here we are. Like, I'm sure we could get into, some different scenarios to watch with Randle this season. I'm not really sure where you want to take it, but I've got a couple that I think could be pertinent.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Julius thing is there's a lot with that. I mean, I don't know. I think that at various points, the Knicks have definitely at least listened and checked in on what his value was. I don't think they've ever had an offer on the table for him that was like there was not like the problem that they always had with Julius was he was more important to them than he was ever going to be to another team. And every time I think that they have at least listened in on offers, that has become abundantly clear. And honestly, I just totally believe this. I don't really know how much Julius Randle even matters to the Timberwolves in this trade. Like, I think what matters to them is the potential that he could opt out of his contract. My belief is that they will trade him before that because to me, there's only two ways. Like, I think either scenario where they keep Randle is a kind of bad situation for Minnesota. If they go to they're going to go to the playoffs. If he goes to the playoffs and he shows out for the first time in his career in the playoffs, then he's going to have a bigger market than he's ever had
He'll
because that
decline his
will,
option.
yeah, well, he'll decline his option and then he'll have a bigger market than he's ever had because he will have showed like, hey, no, see, like I was hurt the previous time in New York and the first time we played Atlanta, nobody was on my team. I'm actually good. See, like I'm fine. And then if he sucks in the playoffs, he's going to pick up that option because that will totally nuke his market. Nobody is going to be like, yeah, well, let's commit 40. I don't even think he'll get a 40 or $100 million contract if he sucks in the playoffs again. Like I don't see it because I don't know what team is like, well, what if we commit to age 30 to 34 Julius or whatever it is? Like to me it's like a bad situation. So I think he's on the move at some point. That expiring contract can deliver value for them. Maybe they just want an expiring and a pick.
Well, I was gonna add too. Like I think the if you're playing in the trade machine and you're the Timberwolves and you're looking to offload Julius Randle, like I think you'd expect that Naz Reid would step into the starting lineup, or that you'd finagle it in some way where there's going to be a number of games where Donte DiVincenzo is going to start at point guard when Mike Conley isn't going to play because Finch has told Mike Conley that he's not going to play as many games as he played last season. But if you're playing around in the trade machine, I think you want to look at the number for the Timberwolves, which is the second apron, and that if they're going to trade Julius Randle um, before the trade deadline, I think trying to find a way where that gets them under the second apron for this season is going to be a major motivation in doing that. And so something that I've found to be pretty interesting was Ian Begley reported that Detroit was a team that was interested in Julius Randle, or at least like registered interest with the Knicks, throughout this process. And that, if you traded, Julius Randle and one other player on the Timberwolves for, and maybe that one other player goes, in a third team in a separate transaction. But if you traded Julius Randle and say Keita Bates-Diop, and you got back a package of players that made less than $21 million guaranteed or combined. So you could look at, Isaiah Stewart and Malik Beasley would get you exactly that 21 million mark. You would be under the second apron. And you could potentially then have Isaiah Stewart, fill that role of what is potentially the most pressing question with the Timberwolves right now, at least in terms of their roster and the rotation, is, how are you going to handle who's going to start at the 4? And then how are you going to handle the backup 5 minutes? Because I don't think you're going to play Luka Garza in that role. And you're probably going to be having either Naz Reid or Julius Randle play that role. And both guys have really spent the majority of their seasons, the last couple of seasons, trending towards trying to play down as much as they can, whether it be at the 3 or the 4. For both of those guys respectively. So that's the type of deal that I think I would be monitoring. Ian Begley also mentioned Atlanta and Miami as potential targets, but it's much more difficult to come up with a trade with those two teams, at least 1-to-1, that would provide you with that ability to get underneath the second apron, while still also getting back a player that you could slot into your rotation that you'd feel really comfortable giving minutes to. So that's what's going to be most interesting for me. But that's a scenario that I certainly, I guess would kind of circle as a type of deal that the Timberwolves could pursue, or at least what I would be trying to do if I were in the Timberwolves shoes.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely consideration. I think the kind of the what are the thread they're trying to, or needle, what is it, needle thread the needle, whatever, thread the needle. What they're trying to do here is like they need to cut salary, but they want to remain competitive. So and they don't want to take back like shit, obviously. So that's why I think the Randle, this whole trade for them made sense. It was like whether or not Randle is part of our future. One, we're cutting salary in this trade anyway, so that's good. Two, we're getting back Keita Bates-Diop, which is huge, obviously, massive coup getting him back, bringing him home, hometown lad. But no, super. And also, obviously, Donte is a nice cost control piece. And then you get a first round pick. It's like, again, like to your point, were you ever really going to get a better offer for Cat at any point moving forward than that? Probably not. Like you might have gotten a similar offer, but I think that was the best you were going to do.
And how many offers too? I mean,
Right.
obviously it's not something that conventional, trade conversation wisdom would tell you, but I think you could also put on the receiving end for the Timberwolves is long-term security for Naz Reid and
Yeah.
potentially
Yeah.
Nickeil
Yeah. Absolutely.
Alexander-Walker. And those guys certainly would have been the opportunity cost of keeping Karl Anthony Towns long term. And I certainly think that those two guys probably probably are more valuable together long term moving forward for the Wolves around Anthony Edwards than Karl Anthony Towns might be by himself solely because of the financial aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're probably going to be able to keep both those guys combined at less than whatever Carl is going to make next season. So that's a huge piece for them. As far as like the one thing I still have a lot of questions about with Minnesota is offensively. Like I think Conley has been exactly what you expected him to be, like a nice steady hand at point. And obviously Anthony Edwards has been really, really good. He is now unequivocally like the face of the franchise, and everything centers around him. I wonder if they're. I mean, obviously they've already given him the keys anyway, the proverbial keys. I think what I'm unsure about is like I don't know. I think Randall has to start as long as he's there. I just don't see a scenario where like you tell Julius Randle he's coming off the bench and he's like, "Yep, that sounds great to me. I'm going to do it. No problem." Like I just think you'll get even if he does it, he's just going to pout and moan, and it's just not going to be a good situation. So I think he'll start. I do like the idea of, and I've said this before. I think Karl Anthony Towns is I think he's a better offensive player than Julius Randle in totality. But in terms of pure like creation, I think Randle gives you more. I think Randle is a better creator. I think he is better at drawing two to the ball and kicking out to shooters, and that's valuable. I would say that you need shooters, and like I'm very worried about the starting lineup with Randle and Gobert. I think Randle can play with Gobert. That's not really an issue to me. But Jaden McDaniels is a guy who, for the things he does well, obviously he's a great defensive player. The 3-point accuracy and volume has not arrived yet. That's still a work in progress. Anthony Edwards is obviously a very capable shooter, a tremendous scorer. I don't love his off-ball play yet. That's also okay. Like that's maybe something he has to develop, and
He said that was the number one takeaway that he got from playing with the Olympic team was just watching what Steph Curry does without the ball in his hands and how hard he works to try to create baskets for himself just with his movement off the ball. So that's certainly something that I would hope that is at least a little bit better next season,
Yeah,
but it's unquestionably a fair
yeah,
criticism.
yeah. And he's 23 years old. Like I think it takes guys. It can take guys, especially guys like him, who have played with the ball in their hands all their careers, time, even when their mind, like you said, like his mind is in the right place, to know that you have to do it and then to actually figure out how to do it are two separate things. So even if I think it'll still take him time, but it is good to hear that he acknowledges that. And then Conley, like, yeah, he's a good off ball player for sure. But again, it's like you mentioned, they want to cut down his minutes, and you're looking at, what is he, 36, 37? Is he older than that?
Yeah, I wanna say he's 37, but he might be 38. He's 36. He's
Okay,
36.
36. Let's not add age on this man.
Yeah, turns
But
30, turns 37 next week.
okay, so well, he's 37 for all intents and purposes. Um, like they're already looking ahead, right, to try and figure out, okay, where are we going after, right? They trade into the draft last year to get Rob Dillingham. They give up the 2031 unprotected pick, and then they gave up a 2030 swap. Is that right? So they made a big bet on Dillingham. I'm not convinced that just because they made that a bet on Dillingham that they're like, well, this is our point guard of the future and say la vie. Like, I think they need to still be aggressive in looking for maybe a guy who can help Anthony Edwards, because as good as he is as a scorer, I still think he's very much a work in progress in terms of his ability to make the right reads and create for others. And again, that's fine because he's 23 years old. He's entering just his 5th year in the league. Like, it takes these guys time to develop all that. But like, I still feel like they could use another creator, which is why like I get the idea of getting Julius, even if it's just a temporary thing. But that permanent solution of the other guy who can really help Edwards offensively, maybe it's Dillingham. I don't know that you want to just be like, well, we got Dillingham, everything is good now. Like, I would imagine that maybe not in this next transaction they make, be it with Julius Randle or whatever, if that's the goal. But I do think in the next 12 to 18 months, I envision that being something that becomes more and more of a maybe the type of trade that they get linked to.
Yeah, no question about it. I think
And I think I'm just sorry not to interrupt, but I think even going back to maybe last summer, a couple summers before, like they were interested in DeJounte Murray. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that was reported. It was also reported that there was some reported interest as well in Bogdan Bogdanovic as well, who honestly is a somewhat comparable player to Dante DiVincenzo in that,
Oh yeah,
I think he's a guy who can play some minutes at point guard. Like, probably not a guy that you want, as your full time starting point guard, but
you can
I,
run like they can run like 2 or 3 pick and rolls. They can do the 2 or 3.
yeah, or you can at least bring the ball up
Yeah,
and try to
yeah,
get you into your offense a little bit early, and that's why I think he's an important pickup because he can kind of serve as another bridge between Mike Conley but when it's full time Mike Conley to full time Rob Dillingham, and that you at least have another guy there that you probably trust a little bit more than Nickeil Alexander Walker in terms of his playmaking instincts. But yeah, I think certainly like when you looked at 2 seasons ago when Karl Anthony Towns was out with that calf strain that he missed 4 or 5 months with, whatever it was, it was very evident that the Timberwolves needed a second offensive star or another guy that could help him carry the load because Jaden McDaniels and Naz Reid just weren't ready yet. And I think this past season when Karl Anthony Towns missed a month or whatever it was with that torn meniscus, Naz Reid certainly stepped up. Jaden McDaniels didn't step up quite as much as you wanted to, but Edwards himself looked significantly more ready to handle a bigger workload than he did 2 seasons ago. But the thing that I would kind of raise the alarm or sound the alarm bell there is like, I just don't think that Anthony Edwards has enough gas in the tank
for a full
because of
year.
how explosive of an
Yeah,
athlete he is and how, just fast paced and downhill the nature of his game is, like to take on a Luka or James Harden type role. I just don't think you're going to see that from Anthony Edwards because he's going to get tired and he's going to, his effectiveness is going to dip over a longer period of time, taking on that role. So I think Randle for sure is a guy who can create for himself off the dribble and go get a shot on lineups that Anthony Edwards is not in there. I think you could probably insulate him with guys like Nickeil and Donte and maybe even Jaden too, is just like, guys who are defenders, but also can shoot on the right night and then just kind of let the chips fall as they may from there. I think, what's going to be really interesting to me is how Julius Randle will fit into Chris Finch's offensive system, in that, Chris Finch doesn't like to call a lot of plays. He likes his guys to play, kind of, within a certain structure, if you will, but playing random is what he calls it all the time. And I think Naz Reid is a perfect guy. I think Donte DiVincenzo is a perfect guy. He's a guy that can just, make quick decisions with the ball in his hand, be a willing catch and shoot guy, be willing to just catch it, put it on the deck right away, make a quick decision, whether it's to score at the rim or create for someone else. And whether Julius Randle is more of a ball stopper that he's been at times in New York, or or more of a willing passer, and decisive downhill scorer that he's been at times in New York. I think we've certainly seen both of those sides of Julius Randle. And I think it just for Finch, if Randle's going to be on the team, I think it's just about, which Julius Randle are you going to get? Is it going to be 80-20 good, bad Randle? Is it going to be 70-30? Is it going to take some time for him to fit in?
yeah.
And he's also shown a willingness to play out of the corner too, which I think is something that's going to be important whether it's Conley and Gobert running pick and roll or Ant and Gobert running pick and roll. There's just going to be times where he's going to have to spot up in the corner and shoot a lot better than what he's shot from there in his career. But at this point, like, I just don't know that that's a reasonable ask if you're the Timberwolves, which again, I think just goes back and feeds like how do you balance the need for a second, guy who can score in isolation and create his own shot like Randle versus, or draw to and kind of, have some gravity to you as an offensive player versus, just surrounding Ant with more spacing and shooting and being able to, find 35 minutes a game for Naz Reid.
Yeah, I mean, the Randall part of it is like I would not expect him to change much in terms of like the speed of his decision making. The quality of his decision making overall, I think, has definitely improved over his career, even though he'll still have frustrating moments. I wouldn't even worry about like is he going to be good? Yeah, I think he will be good because he's a good player. Like I'm not, I don't, I'm never, you know, whatever my concerns have been over Julius Randle's time in New York, I would say pretty firmly over the last couple of seasons, it's been very clear, like, this guy's a good player. Like, there's no question about that. I would guess that it might take him a little time to get up to speed. He is recovering from a shoulder surgery. I still don't know if he's ready for full contact yet. I know he played in some pickup runs during the offseason, or towards the very end, but I still would guess that they're going to be cautious with that because it was a very serious shoulder injury, dislocated shoulder, and he didn't require surgery on it. So I imagine they would be cautious with him, especially given like, hey, if you are looking to maybe trade this guy down the line, like you got to make sure he's healthy. So I would imagine they're pretty prudent and cautious with him there. As far as like, you know, he's definitely somebody who, if he's on the floor, you got to get him involved. Otherwise, like his effort very much wanes and goes with like his involvement, and not just his involvement, his effectiveness. Like I think when Julius is going well offensively, he is more locked in other areas of his game. His rebounding, his defense, whatever. He's still gonna have those same brain farts that he has, but like not to the same degree. When he struggles offensively, and this is why I think he can be so frustrating, is when he struggles offensively, he really lets it affect everything, not just in terms of effort, but also his body language. And then even, he takes out his frustration on teammates, refs, whatever, and it just can be a very, very frustrating thing. He did really improve last season, his demeanor towards the refs, so I think he deserves credit for that. But yeah, like I'm not worried. Yeah, again, I would not be worried about is Julius Randle good. I would worry definitely more about like how all of that pieces together collectively. And then I will say, like, just a touch on Jaden McDaniels, like he is now his extension is now kicked in. So he is now a 5-year, $135 million player. I really do not like the fit between him and Randle at the 3 and 4. I think you're not going to get enough shot volume, 3-point volume out of them. I know Randle a couple years ago did really increase his 3-point volume. He was a 34% shooter. And the way Finch has used his 4s, like I know Cat did shoot 3s, but he wasn't like a high volume 3-point shooter.
No, it was something that fans were begging him to do more of.
Yeah. And so that's something to consider. It's worth mentioning he actually did coach Randle in New Orleans.
Yep.
Yeah, and Randle had a really, really good year. It was also a very weird year because that was like the Anthony Davis was kind of there, but then he checked out halfway through, and then it was just like Randle got to play a bunch of the 5, so his minutes got juiced a little bit. But it is good they have that kind of familiarity with each other. But
yeah, it's funny you mentioned McDaniels next to Randle because the person who's I guess who Cat impacted the most was unquestionably Jaden McDaniels. Like you look at Jaden McDaniels, on off splits with Carl on versus Carl off, it's like night and day how different it was. Because you'd try to pair Ant with Gobert as much as you could, and then you'd try to pair Cat with Jaden McDaniels as much as you could, and then you could interchange Naz Reid between kind of those two sets and that bifurcate rotation that Chris Finch would have. And it's going to be interesting. Like, I think Jaden McDaniels has had some stretches where he's looked the part of a 40% 3-point shooter. And he's had some stretches where he's looked the part of a 30% 3-point shooter. And I just think it's going to be a matter of like which guy is it going to be? Because if it's more of the 40, then I think he's a great fit next to Julius Randle. Is a guy that can cut off of him and collapse the backside of the defense. Obviously, he's a great defensive fit next to Julius Randle. Is a guy who can help insulate him a little bit. But yeah, it's a huge bet on Jaden McDaniels this move, no question. And I think we're going to learn a lot about whether Jaden McDaniels really does have the career trajectory of a guy that's going to make $103 million over the next 4 or 5 years, whatever it is, or a guy where it was a really promising young player and the bet just didn't hit. And I think this year we're going to learn a lot about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think not just in terms of percentage with Jaden, but also the volume. Like, when you're playing next to Julius, like I said, like, and this is something I think the Knicks kind of understood and kind of leaned into over time, was like, all right, well, if we're building with Julius in mind, we really, really need to prioritize getting guys that aren't just maybe hit good percentages, but are willing to just fucking launch. And whatever, RJ Barrett, for all of his flaws as a player with New York, he was very willing to take threes. He was did not shoot a great percentage, but he was very willing to shoot threes. Donte DiVincenzo obviously launched threes. Reggie Bullock was a guy that they got to increase his 3-point volume. Jalen Brunson, Emmanuel Quickly, on and on and on. Like, they got guys that did that. So to me, it's like and Julius himself has talked about this. One of the things, like, obviously before Tibbs gets there, it's a good player, but I don't think anybody was like all-star, all-NBA caliber ever. And obviously his first year with Tibbs, all of a sudden he comes out and you're like, holy shit, what is this? But he talked about it then. He talked about, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, Tibbs offense, there are bad things and good things about this, but one of the good things is like guys kind of are in the same places. So Julius talked about it, he's like, it's so nice because I know wherever I am on the floor, I know exactly where my outlets are. And obviously key to that is having guys that can knock down those shots. So I think it's not just going to be like, can Jaden shoot 40%? Or, I mean, forget 40%. Can you shoot 37%? Can you shoot 37%? But also, like, okay, well, if Julius kicks it out to him 3 or 4 times in a game, is he just going to be, and let me tell you, the way Julius slings the ball to you, that is like you're catching like a fucking, I guess now for the Vikings, you could say a Sam Darnold heater.
It's not a change from Karl Anthony Towns,
yeah,
that's for sure.
Yeah, and so like it's like, all right, are you just going to be ready to put up and shoot? And that's always the piece that I think guys struggled with Randle, because if you didn't shoot it, he would get really, really frustrated and he could lose trust in you. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. What I also will say is this is a temporary problem, because I did see Chris Finch's comments at Media Day yesterday where he was like, it's on me to get Jaden more usage, more touches, more involved offensively. And look, I think Finch is, part of it is on him. I think part of it is also like he needs to have that trust in Jaden McDaniels to be able to like, okay, I trust this guy to give him those touches. So we'll see how that goes. But the fact that he's already saying that, I think you're seeing where this is moving long term. Whether that means Jaden plays, maybe he plays more 4 in the future, sticks it, whatever it is. Like, I think you're going to see at least him get those opportunities now, and the Randle piece of it will solve itself within the next 6 or 7, 8 months, whatever it is. All right. Moving on from, actually, wait, did you have any Donte questions? I know you had a Donte question, right?
Yeah, I just think that a big question that Timberwolves fans are going to have is, like, you think about a Malik Beasley type player, right? Like, Malik Beasley set the world on fire, the second half of the season that he was in Minnesota, with Chris Finch, or maybe it was the first. I don't remember which part of the season, but yeah, like a crazy part of the season where he's just going.
It was a part of the season.
Yeah, where he's just going like absolutely bananas from 3, and Finch was coming up with all these crazy plays for a really dynamic off the shooter that plays off the ball, that can come off screens. Like, how much of that will be transferable to a Donte DiVincenzo type player?
I would say this is what I will say about Donte DiVincenzo. He is a very willing shooter. He's got range. He can get that shot off pretty damn quick. I don't know how, like, the level of confidence he played with last season. And okay, there's a couple things need to be said. Last year, he shot where it was like 40%, 41% on something like 15, I think 15.6 threes per 100 possessions. To put that in context, that was like the third highest 3-point rate in the league. He had the third most threes made and taken in the league. This is basically a prime Klay Thompson level of shooting season. Okay. So that should lay that out. Now, is Donte DiVincenzo that player? Is that what he is? I would say this. I said this multiple times. I think if he was still in New York, I would 100% expect him to continue to be that player because the circumstances of playing in New York with Jalen Brunson, with Josh Hart, now with Mikal Bridges, but these guys that like inherently have this trust and bond between each other is so unique. That's very rare in the NBA to have the type of bond and trust that those guys have. Like DiVincenzo was a groomsman at Brunson's wedding, so this goes beyond just like, oh, we're good teammates. Like, no, this is like a very deep trust. Do I think he can replicate that in Minnesota? Maybe. It's possible he can. My money would bet he does not, both because I don't know that he's a prime Klay Thompson level shooter. Like that's a pretty high bar. And the level he shot at last year, it's very possible to shoot like that 1 year, dip, and still be a damn good shooter. So like I'm not talking about this guy is going to come in and now he's going to shoot 34%. Like, no, I think he's definitely a 37, 38% minimum type guy. And he's going to get it up on volume and he'll shoot from range, which really matters. But like, can you use him in a variety of different ways? Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I was looking through his, because you had kind of DM'd that to me earlier today. So I was kind of looking through his play types last year. And I would say like Tibbs definitely did a good job of using him in a variety of ways. But there's probably still some stuff that you could toggle around, maybe use him more off screens and stuff like that. Obviously, Tibbs' offense, especially prior to Julius getting injured, we know like Tibbs has his like number one, number two guys, and then everything kind of works off those. But after Randle got hurt, like you saw a lot more like creativity in terms of having to cut and move and screen and all that type of stuff that the team and the individual players had to lean into. He was a piece of that. So he can definitely play in a more movement heavy offense and be a very, very effective piece. But like I do feel like the circumstances of him in New York they were so perfect individually in a way. I don't know that this is not even just about Minnesota. Like I just don't know that he can recreate that anywhere else.
And I don't think the Timberwolves are expecting him to necessarily.
Yeah.
I just think it's the type of player that he is and the role that he can fill is one that the Timberwolves really had a glaring hole last year, especially in that Dallas series.
Yeah, no, and look, you need guys that give you variance, the way that he can put up threes, and he'll have like 7, 8. I mean, he set the record for most threes in the game by a Nick last year. He had 12. So like he's a guy who can just get crazy hot and win you a game for sure. And to your point, like Minnesota did not have that type of shooter last year. They just needed it and they didn't have it. So he gives you something you didn't have. I like that addition. And like I said, like I think they'd really benefit if they can open up more minutes for him as the season goes along. I actually was listening to, I forgot who it was. I was listening to a pod and somebody was saying that they think their best lineup would be like Donte, Ant, Jaden, Julius, and Rudy or whatever it was. And I was like, I like that lineup, but like I'm also like, you're asking a lot of Anthony Edwards to create in that lineup because Donte can bring the ball up and sure he can run a pick and roll every now and then, but he is not a point guard and you don't want him to run point guard. So like I think they'll again like what we talked about in the open, like there's still work to be done on Tim Connolly's part in sorting this roster out in a variety of ways. But as we have seen from him, I believe that this might not be the finished article of the team. And a lot of the kind of verbiage I've seen coming out after the trade indicates it's like this isn't just about competing for the next 2 or 3 years. It's about competing for like the next 10 years around Anthony Edwards type stuff. So I wonder if internally they understand, like, I don't want to say it's a transitional year, but it's a year where it's like, we might not be like we might not be quite the contender we were last year, but like the moves that we are now in line to be able to make and kind of shift and evolve the roster, that is, maybe next year, that is when we really feel good about, like, okay, now this team is in place and maybe better position than we were kind of in 2023-24 when we did still have Carl.
Yeah, no question. I think this team values continuity, and you'd say, oh, well, if they value continuity, why aren't they just running it back? And I think, well, it's next year, if you were to trade Carl, then the next 5, 6, 7 years looks like it's a lot more in flux. If you roll into next offseason, not necessarily being able to break this thing down on your own terms and rebuild it back up on your own terms. But I think now that's what they're really able to do, is that you can at least see the path of, they could go Ant at the 1 path with Rob Dillingham coming off the bench. You could go, having just like a bridge point guard next to Ant and still having Jade, Nas, Rudy, and guys coming off the bench that are really talented. And the other nice thing too with all this is, like, with bringing in another guy like DiVincenzo, is like, you're just not going to have to rely as heavily on Rob Dillingham and TJ Shannon right off the rip, which I think is going to be really important, and allow them to kind of have the freedom to fail. And that's kind of the same thing with Ant too, from a creation standpoint, right? Is like, yes, you're going to be asking a lot more of Ant to do a lot more creating on nights when Mike Conley isn't playing, or times when Mike Conley isn't on the floor. But I think we've seen that trial by fire has helped Ant out a lot when it comes to the playoffs, when he's got the ball in his hands every single time down the floor and you're asking him to, create an advantage for you by himself. And I think you saw a much better job that he did in this past playoffs in the playoff than the 2023 playoffs. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how he evolves and whether that evolution, I guess, will inform, what they end up doing with Julius Randle, or which path, I guess, they end up going down.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on to Karl Anthony Towns. So I was looking through. So there's a few things. Obviously, the Knicks make this trade. One, they obviously wanted Karl Anthony Towns. Clearly, well, no shit, right? They traded for him. But watching them in the playoffs, you watch the playoffs, obviously, and you see, like, okay, Boston can go 5 out, and Indiana can go 5 out, and we play the Sixers, who can go 5 out because Embiid can shoot threes, and you guys had the option to go 5 out, and Dallas can go 5. Well, actually, Dallas didn't really have a 5 out option this year. Anyway, the point being is, like, you kind of want
Kleber
every
erasure.
team. Yeah, that we will be erasing Maxi Kleber in 2024. But like you see the value of those things in real time, and obviously the Knicks playing against 2 of those teams in the playoffs, I think it kind of informs some of their decision making. Cat obviously gives you that option. There are very, very obvious strengths that come with that, and then there are very, very clear down, kind of things you have to mitigate. Let's say that come with that. When it comes to the offensive stuff with him at the 5, I think, yeah, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but like, I think this is, I tweeted this out this morning. So would you say it's fair in the last 2 years since you traded for Rudy Gobert that Cat was predominantly, they were trying to like protect him defensively and use him, and as a result, he was very much a 4 in most cases. Is that fair to say?
Oh, for sure. I mean, he still
Yeah.
played plenty of minutes at the 5 when
Yeah.
Rudy wasn't on the floor. I mean, Carl was playing the 5 whenever Rudy was
Yeah.
not on the floor.
Yeah.
But certainly they tried to make him more of a 4 to maintain a lot more of that optionality from a lineup perspective.
So like, I think so. I didn't want to take a look at that, and also like the team has been good the last 2 years, and so it is what it is. But I kind of looked at the roster from Tibbs's last year until I guess Chris Finch's first full year as the head coach, so the year before they trade for Rudy Gobert, and you kind of look at those rosters and you're like, even when Cat is at the 5 here, there's not really like a super dynamic offensive grouping they can put him in. And now you drop him in New York, and you kind of look at the ability that of what the Knicks can do in terms of putting pieces around him there. And I would say that Brunson is the best offensive creator he's played with in his career so far. And I would say that like then you also have obviously Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby, Josh Hart, Deuce, whatever. The talent they can put around him offensively feels like if we're going to see the optimized version of Cat at the 5, or like I don't even know if that's, I think the right way to put it would be a version a lineup where Cat's offensive ability at the 5 amplifies everything to a level that is crushing teams offensively. I feel very confident like the Knicks have it in a way that the Wolves were not quite able to ever do. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's certainly fair to say. I mean, this Knicks team is more talented than. I don't. You mean you can split hairs if it was more talented or not than the team the Wolves just rolled out this last season, but like it's unquestionably, right there with the most talent he's ever played with. And I think when you even think about the talent that he had this last season, even when he plays the 5, like, and you wanted to get him posting up because, I mean, he is one of the more efficient post up players in the NBA when he plays the 5 and has the requisite spacing, like, it just wasn't there. And I think now, allowing Carl to isolate and one-on-one, like, I'll just say this. Anytime you get Karl Anthony Towns a one-on-one isolation on the block post up, that's a great possession. That's a great possession. He's going to win that more often than he's not going to win that in terms of getting a good look at the basket or creating a good shot for other players. And when you consider that you've got 4 really solid shooters around him, or in Josh Hart's case, a guy who's a really willing and active cutter, who can finish. But like, yeah, I think that's certainly a good way to put it. I think the one thing that I'm a little leery of with Carl going back to the 5, something that he hasn't been asked to do a lot of this season, is I think obviously people want to talk about the rebounding and the rim protection that Rudy Gobert provides, and kind of took off of Carl's plate a little bit, but Rudy Gobert also set like 80% of the screens in Minnesota too. And Karl Anthony Towns, for as good of an offensive player as he is and as uniquely talented he is a horrible screen setter. He set way too many screens that got him in foul trouble. It made way too many, screens where he just didn't make contact with anyone, or it wasn't productive screen. And so I think that's something that he's really going to have to work on this coming season. Obviously having somebody like Jalen Brunson, who is as crafty and creative with the ball in his hands, and obviously does a great job of, helping his big set good screens by setting it up the right way and playing off of it the right way is obviously huge and really important. And certainly better than Anthony Edwards. Just, I'm just going to fly downhill mentality. No question about it. So that's kind of one thing that I'm going to wonder too. But I think Knicks fans are really going to learn, especially with those, that main, max spacing lineup with Carl playing at the 5, that he's a really, really good left block post up player, especially. And that'll be really efficient. So I think the more that you can get him, playing in the post or shooting threes and doing a little bit less of the driving, obviously the driving is something that he did really, really well in 22 or 21-22, that Grizzlies playoff season, when the Timberwolves had the number 1 offense in the league down the second half of the season. So I'd say if you want to see more of what he can do at the 5, playing in some more spaced out lineups, I'd certainly say go look at some of that film or some of those stats, because I think that's a good indication of what he can do in a pretty optimal environment. And that was when they had Malik Beasley and an Ant too. So I think for Carl, it's about can you shoot threes, can you play in the block, and minimize some of the turnovers from driving. Because I think when he's driving and he's doing it successfully in a really spaced out floor, it's obviously a massive weapon to have, and is a really tough guy for opponents to cover, especially because some of the burlier guys can't stay with him, and some of the lighter guys can't hang with him on the block. So I think it's just a matter of, if the Knicks can put him in advantageous positions and try to put him in those boxes, I guess, or put some guardrails around what he's doing, I think that there's no reason why Carl can't enjoy, even better efficiency than what he's put up so far in his first 9 years of his career, and it's pretty impressive body of work when you look at his overall efficiency from from inside as well as beyond the arc.
Well, yeah, it was kind of funny. I was looking at his playoff stats, and obviously Carl has had very up and down playoff performances. But I was like, oh, 58 true shooting. That's something, huh? So one thing I'm curious about, in terms of his passing, like when you go 5 out, I mean, one thing I was intrigued by when I was watching some of his stuff is like, and correct me if I'm wrong, this feels like a guy you can, get the ball to at the top of the key, and you can cut off of him and cut in, and he's really good at making those passes to cutters. Is that accurate, or is that like a misread on what he's
No, that's certainly accurate. I think he was, especially in Rudy Gobert's first season before Carl got hurt, like Rudy would be across the front of the rim and he would just duck that thing in and try to empower Rudy as much as he could. The Timberwolves haven't had as many great cutters, as I think he'll enjoy playing with in New York, but he and Jaden McDaniels formed a good chemistry off of cuts for sure. And he certainly has the impressive touch and, I guess overall passing talent that you'd hope from somebody that can play kind of that high-low, big man creator role. I think the one thing for Carl is that sometimes he just gets a little too ambitious, and he knows that he can make a pass, so he'll try to make a pass that he probably shouldn't. Every now and again, I'd say probably 25-30% of his passes end up being those overly ambitious, come on, Carl, like time and score type of situations. So again, I think it's just about the guardrails around it and probably living with some growing pains early on. And that I think he'll probably try to form chemistry with those guys early and probably try to throw passes to show like, hey, I'm trying to work with you and I want to make this happen. Because Carl is a really unselfish player by nature. And I think, anyone who's saying otherwise probably didn't watch how much he sacrificed to try to empower Anthony Edwards and then Rudy Gobert and make Rudy, feel empowered and welcome and part of the deal in Minnesota. So I certainly think you'll see that pop early on.
Yeah. With regard to, I mean, is this, I don't know how real this was. He was doing some like pick and rolls, right? With Rudy. Is that was the thing that they were doing? How
Very
was
much a thing.
that? And was that like something that you kind of were impressed by, or was that something that you were like, let's see a little less of that?
No, I think it was certainly something that fans were clamoring to see more of. I think that, especially once, Carl was really, fully recovered from that calf strain and really starting to feel good. And he kind of had some more of that mobility back. I think that was certainly something that the Timberwolves wanted to lean into as a means of being able to, create unique advantages on the offensive end of the floor. And that's where we started to see a lot of the alley oops from Carl to Rudy. I think before, Carl got hurt 2 years ago, and then in this season, I mean, they're one of the 10 most frequent, handler to, or ooper to finisher combos in the NBA. And I certainly think that Carl's passing unlocked a lot of that. When you can put, Mike Conley and Jaden McDaniels, or Mike Conley and, whoever else in the corner, being willing and ready to shoot threes, I think that also, makes it a pretty difficult thing for opposing defenses to guard. And that's certainly something that I think the Knicks would be smart to lean into if he does spend time playing out there with Precious Achiuwa. Because, again, like the Knicks are going to be able to surround that with, especially if you can have McCall and OG in the corner or Brunson in the corner. Like I think that's going to be, certainly something that they should watch out for. And we saw the Knicks do a little bit of it with Randle and Robinson, Randle and Hartenstein too. But I think certainly, it's something that I think Rudy Gobert being able to play above the rim was a huge factor in. So, if I know all things are pointing towards the Knicks trading Robinson, but if they don't, I certainly think that's something you'd probably see more with the two of them than with him and Achiuwa, just with Achiuwa not necessarily being the same kind of vertical threat that Mr. Robinson or Rudy Gobert is.
Yeah. I actually even wonder if they can do that with him and OG. But we've talked a lot about his offense, and I think whatever, the flaws of his offense can be, I know that a tendency to pick up charges is one of them. and that's definitely something that will be annoying. But I guess maybe that's like better than, I don't know. I guess if like I'm comparing worlds of turnovers, I'm like, I guess I'd rather have a charge than a
And
live ball Randle turnover, unless
what's
Carl Towns picks up his third foul in the first 10 minutes of a game. Maybe then I won't. So yeah.
What's frustrating is it's the hook, right? It's when he kind of gets up under the arm on the drive. And that's part of the thing is like if you can keep him in the post or you can keep him shooting threes, you have less of the kind of drive and
Him trying to do like a Harden
and
thing, right?
and Britt Robson, who's a phenomenal writer for Min Post here in the Twin Cities, turned the coined the term stray voltage, and that's when you start to see the stray voltage coming from Carl is on the drive when he would hook defenders and kind of flail around and try to throw these passes, and then you'd start to see him complaining more of the refs and stuff like that. So it's like, if he can stay away from hooking defenders and coming up with, it's between that and setting bad screens, I think are the two biggest knocks on his offensive game that can be pretty detrimental. But like you said, it's not a whole lot of live ball stuff.
Yeah. So look, the offense, I'm not too worried about the offense. I think they'll have some growing pains, but they should be, I mean, look, this should be one of the best offenses in the league. Defensively is obviously the big question with Karl Towns. And I guess there's two pieces of this. One, I think there's this idea that like Tibbs still plays deep drop until his eyes bleed. And that's just not accurate. He has, he was having Robinson and Hartenstein play more at the level of screens. He was doing a lot more different things. He's talked about, switching more now because they have OG and McCall and these guys. What I'm wondering is like, one, Carl early in his career obviously played for Tom Thibodeau. He was not great in deep drop at all. I should say, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, they would then often have like Jang or Taj then take those duties, right? And then, Cat would be the 4 effectively on defense. So Cat's been the 4 on defense for long stretches of his career. One, I guess the first part is, and I'll just ask this, like, when Cat is doing 4 things on defense, is that something you're comfortable with? Because I know that Minnesota fans were very, very impressed with like his performance against Kevin Durant in this year's first round series against Phoenix. So I'm curious, like, and obviously now you've seen it for 2 full seasons where he's playing the 4 next to Rudy. Is he just like, are you comfortable with him defensively at the 4? Is that something he's good at and you're good with him doing?
Yeah, I certainly think that I think Carl's defensive versatility has grown a lot in the last 3 years. I think you also have to go back to we'll get into that when we talk about Carl's a 5, but I certainly think that his discipline defensively has gotten a lot better. And I think when he's been asked to play the 4, I think more of what he's done is he's really had to learn how to communicate really well with his teammates, because I think what we saw early 2 seasons ago was there was particularly a game against the Phoenix Suns, and this was when they still had Chris Paul and Cam Johnson and those guys, and they just ran Carl off screens over and over and over and over again, and everyone was like, oh well, this too big experiment is just going to go down the tubes because everyone's just going to run shooters off of Cat. And the Wolves really learned throughout the course of the last 2 seasons just how to communicate and switch those types of screens better, and just play more cohesively as a unit, right? Because like as much as when we talk about matchups and we talk about defenses, we think that it's just going to be so much, it's very easy to pick on this guy, or it's very easy to, highlight this one specific matchup as something that you just need to relentlessly attack over and over and over again. I think, these NBA defenses do a pretty good job of playing together as a unit and figuring out how to kind of mitigate some of the weaknesses that they have. And I think for Carl, it really helps that he's really long, right? So, he's gotten much better at being able to, whether it's rear view contest or, cover ground and be able to block shots, guys that are driving in front of him, being able to funnel them to, a shot blocker. I think he's certainly gotten a lot better at that. That as well. And I just think the biggest thing for Carl too is like his off-ball awareness has gotten a lot better. I think he's done a better job as a backside rim protector as well. I think part of it is that he knows he could have been or he could get a little bit more aggressive with Rudy Gobert being the guy there, or having Jaden McDaniels rotate behind him or Anthony Edwards rotate behind him, as two pretty high level defensive playmakers when they're locked in. So I certainly think that, then his ability to, like the Kevin Durant example that you brought up, I think a lot of that was like Kevin Durant didn't really want to drive into the paint and play against Rudy Gobert. So I think Cat was able to just stay solid on the perimeter and, not bite on pump fakes, stay down for the most part, and just use his tall reach and length to contest really without leaving the floor. I think was something that we really saw that was impressive from Karl, and he's gotten a lot better at not fouling, right? I think it's like I said,
so
the
annoying. Most of his fouls now
discipline.
are on fucking offense.
I know it's pretty impressive that he's one of the rare players that can sometimes get into foul trouble solely because of offensive fouls. But I certainly think that his defensive discipline in terms of staying down and staying solid and keeping guys in front of him. Obviously, Kevin Durant's a much bigger guy who's not as explosive as he once was, but Cat forced Kevin Durant into a ton of jump shots and contested them really well and ultimately won that matchup. And I think, that was a huge reason why the Timberwolves not only won that series, but pretty much dominated that series. And and then you look at the next series too. I think this can kind of be a good transition into what Karl can do at the 5. I think, the Timberwolves really like to run this defensive coverage where they had Rudy kind of as a free safety and Karl kind of being the big body in the paint. So you'd have Karl guarding Jokic, and then Rudy Gobert sagging off of Aaron Gordon and just daring Aaron Gordon to shoot threes and allowing Rudy Gobert to just roam and play rim protector behind the defense and then be there as a guy that can contest shots on Jokic when he would spin off of Cat and do whatever off of Cat. But people can go look this up. People can go look through my tweet history. There is not a single person in the NBA who has done a better job of guarding Nikola Jokic over the last 3-4 seasons, including the playoffs, and Karl Anthony Towns. He's held him to the lowest shooting percentage by far of any player in that time frame, and he's played Jokic a ton. And so he can really hang with bigger and burlier guys. It's just a matter of how disciplined he can be. We've seen another bigger and burlier guy like Embiid, someone that he'll see a ton of. With the Knicks. Karl's really struggled in that matchup defensively. He struggled to not foul Embiid. And obviously Embiid's flopping has been a huge part of it. I know that we have a common audience there, or a common grievance to share there. But and then the other part of Karl at the 5 is the drop coverage that you talked about. And I think up until this past season, it was something that was a huge red flag, huge weakness for Karl. But unquestionably, Karl had his best season as a drop big this past season. I certainly think playing with Rudy Gobert and being able to pick up some things from Rudy Gobert in practice made a huge difference.
Is that something he talked about?
Yeah, certainly. But I think the overwhelming, kind of common denominator in all of his defensive successes, I guess, this past season was just rooted in discipline. I think his defensive discipline got a lot better. And I think he kind of was able to marry what he did 3 years ago. So that Grizzlies run where the Timberwolves had one pitch. It was an 105-mile-an-hour fastball that was, just a high wall at the level coverage that they played on Ja Morant and the Grizzlies. And it really enabled Karl to be more of a playmaker. I think he's more of a defensive playmaker by instinct, and he wants to be up there and kind of use his hands and be active and make plays on the ball. That was kind of how he started that. And then, he also needed to learn how to, have more of an off-speed pitch and have a, sitting more at like 92, 93 in drop coverage. And I think the first year that they played drop, right when Rudy's first year, obviously he was hurt some too, but he just, you could tell he was so wired to just do the high wall thing that it took him a while to kind of figure out how can I still keep that playmaker mentality, but also achieve a certain level of defensive discipline that
you have to defend too when you're playing drop, right?
That the team needs to remain in structure, right? And I think we saw a lot more of that this past season. And so, it's not surprising to me that Tibbs is saying, hey, maybe and obviously those comments probably presupposed Karl, being traded to the Knicks, but
I feel like they might have known. They might have known that it was
maybe. But, I think it makes sense because you can draw again, like Knicks fans that want to see what Karl can do at the 5. Like, you go back, find some clips of him playing drop coverage from this past season, because that was certainly his best season. But also go back and watch that 21-22 second half of the season and into the playoffs when Carl played pretty much exclusively high wall in that. And it was pretty cool to see, what he was able to do at the point of attack. And I think it doesn't surprise me one bit that they're probably going to do a little bit of everything, whether it be drop, high wall, and do some switching as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say I remember like that 21-22 season, they were like really, really aggressive coverages all the time. I think like Vanderbilt was like huge for them for that reason that season where he's like cleaning up on the back end on stuff. But I thought like I did not think Karl Anthony Towns had a particularly like great offensive series against Memphis that year. I know he did have one really monster game though. But his defense in that series was actually really good. He did a phenomenal job challenging Morant at the rim. I thought that was like the first time in my life I was like, is Karl Anthony Towns good on defense now? Is that what's happening here? But he was really good then. And, part of the reason that they made the switch to get Rudy Gobert wasn't just about Karl Anthony Towns defense. It was also like, we can't rebound the basketball. And
It
that
was
was a
like, hey, what
major
if Jared Vanderbilt was 7'2" and probably like the
right.
greatest rim protector ever? Like,
And can grab rebounds, like and will get rebounds. So what if he can do that? So I do think that's something the Knicks, when they do go 5 out and
And
whatever, like,
and just one quick thing on the
yep,
rebounding thing too. Like, I think part of why the Wolves struggle to rebound is because Karl Anthony Towns is 25 feet away from the basket
right,
playing up in
right,
coverage. It wasn't that Karl Anthony Towns is a bad rebounder. I think he's a very, very good defensive rebounder. It's just about where he was on the floor.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and like any high usage offensive big, I do think on the defensive glass at times he can take the easy way out of like the ball will just come to me. I don't need to box anybody out. But we are familiar with that having watched Julius Randle, so I get it. I understand it. I know that it will happen. But I tend to agree with you. I don't think it's that he's a bad rebounder. I think in that with those teams he was constantly out of position because he's away from the hoop. Um, Talking about the different coverages that he can run, like, obviously drop, it's great to hear you say that he improved significantly in drop, but like hedging and recovering, like, I mean, and how is he like as a switch big? Because that's something that I don't think in the regular season is that important, if at all, for a big man. But obviously, we know as you go in the playoffs deeper and deeper, that becomes increasingly important. Like, where are you on your comfort level, or I guess not your comfort level anymore, but if you were a Knicks fan, how comfortable would you be having watched Karl Anthony Towns or is yours like executing, playing a switch or hedging and recovering or any of these type of things, or like even like doubling and getting back to his man?
Yeah, I think with Karl, a huge thing is just like who's around him, right? And I think I think who he's playing with influences a lot of the way that he plays. In that, I think it's probably a little bit easier to be more aggressive and take more risks when you've got Jaden McDaniels and Rudy Gobert out there on the floor with him, right? So if you've got OG Anunoby, Mikal Bridges out on the floor with you, like, I do think that there's going to be a lot more room for error there naturally, right? But it would not surprise me one bit is if like in more blended lineups where um, you don't have those guys out there as much, and you're playing with Brunson and Deuce and maybe Precious or something like that. That it's a more conservative coverage. Like I really only feel comfortable with them doing that in a lineup that's got Hart and OG and Mikal out there. I don't think it's something that you want to do a ton of because I think, I think when you consistently ask Karl to switch, I think like you're kind of playing with fire a little bit, and that I don't think Karl can help himself with like trying to reach or trying to block a shot. I think he really wants to make plays, and I think sometimes that tendency to make a play, whether it's kind of a highlight play to get your team going, or a big moment or a big play in a big moment, like I think like he just wants that, and sometimes he can't help himself. Like I said, his defensive discipline did get a lot better this past year, but I think that's just kind of how he's wired. And I think if you're going to roll out switching constantly, like you're just playing with fire, I think what the Wolves did really, really well, and why I think they succeeded so much defensively this past season was mostly because they were able to play in their structure a lot more. They didn't have to rely on switching or, junking it up with these crazy defenses. I think it was just, hey, we're going to trust that our defense is going to be better than your offense in a lot of time it ended up being that way. But they also had the firepower offensively where, like, even if they maintain their structure and how they like to play, like, they didn't have to play from behind and switch it up and get more aggressive. And, a lot of times they were able to kind of dictate the terms of how the games were played. And then obviously when you run into Luka Doncic, it's just like a little bit of a different story. But I really don't think that Karl Anthony Towns' defense was, at all a fact. I think his offense was much more of a factor of why they
Yeah, he just
struggled in
couldn't hit a
that
fucking
series than his
three all.
defense. Yeah, I don't think it was his
Three.
defense.
That was such a weird series for him. I was like, why
And
can't
then
you
game
shoot
4,
now?
it was like he looked awesome. It was like,
Yeah.
oh, finally.
Yeah, it's just, that was like, it was so weird. He just couldn't hit a shot that series. Karl Anthony Towns, he has been coached by Tom Thibodeau previously. This is well documented. They had some clashes while Tibbs was in Minnesota. I wanted to ask about that. Obviously, it seems. Look, I don't think that there's no shot the Knicks make this trade unless Tom Thibodeau is telling them, "Yeah, I'm not worried about that. I think it'll be fine." So I don't think this is like they did this without his blessing. I'm sure that Tibbs knew about it. Would you say that like some of the headbutting that went on there was that some of like one? I think Tibbs' offense, what he prioritizes, the way he wants to use. Like obviously, back then, a lot of the criticism of Tibbs was like, why do we run this like medieval offense? Why aren't we shooting more threes and such? Now Tibbs is like completely embraced the three ball. The Knicks are consistently one of the highest among the top, highest volume 3-point shooting teams in the league. Do you think like that evolution from Tibbs in terms of what kind of his principles are, and like I talked about, this is not like we run deep drop all the time. Like, don't get me wrong, there are definitely games where I'm like, dude, can we please get the fuck out of drop coverage? But you see a lot more versatility in what Tibbs is asking from his centers defensively. Do you think those changes are a positive in terms of like him and Cat reestablishing a positive relationship as a head coach and a player? And then also, like, and you can definitely speak to this more so than I, how much of like what happened in Minnesota in terms of all the acrimony there with Tibbs, between Tibbs and Cat, would you say is directly related to trading for Jimmy Butler and then maybe Tibbs not his inability, I guess I would say, to kind of get Butler to play nice with these other the younger Wolves players that were on the roster at the time?
Yeah, to answer your your second question first, I certainly think that is the root of a lot of it. I think that and I defer people to go read John Krasinski's latest story on the Athletic, because I do think that in his most recent 2 stories, because I do think that John does a very good job of articling, you know, exactly what went wrong between the two of those guys. Like, and he also wrote in there that, like, hey, like, Cat has certainly noted that Tibbs has spoken very highly of him in recent seasons. And I think, that was a long time ago. That was like 7 years ago or 8 years ago, looking back at it. And I think, Karl's like 29 now, 28, 29 versus being a 21, 22-year-old kid back then. And look, like, I think we'd all admit that we're probably more mature and able to handle more of what, maybe not you, but what we're able to deal with at 28, 29 versus 21, 22. And so I think that was certainly part of it. And I think that certainly accelerated some of the, I guess, fracturing of that relationship. But as it pertains to your first question, I don't know that I would say that, like, the style of play is like what's going to be the foundation for a good relationship. I think more so, and I think, again, if you go read that most recent John Krasinski article, like, you will understand that a lot of what matters most to Karl is not basketball. It's his relationships with all the people in the arena, all the people on the team side of things, and the media and the community. Like, I think that was such a huge reason why, um, Timberwolves fans have so staunchly defended Karl Anthony Towns, even when it's been easy for people on the outside to ridicule him, is because he's a genuinely great dude. And I've had plenty of conversations with Karl in the Timberwolves locker room about golf and about life and about football and all sorts of different stuff. And
Disgusting Eagles fandom.
I know, and Yankees fan. Oh,
Oh, that's better. That's fine. That's fine. Okay,
but yeah, and I think the biggest thing that you get out of that is just like how down to earth he is and how good of a dude he is, and I think like that bridge will have to be mended, or if there is a bridge to mend, like I think it has to be done outside of a basketball context. Like I think Karl Anthony Towns in that locker room really fostered a sense of like everybody caring about each other. And I think you go back and you read some of, what came out of media day from Monday from the Timberwolves side of things, is like everyone said how much they are going to miss Karl Anthony Towns, the person, and that he meant a lot to them as individuals. And he meant a lot to that locker room as a dude. And there wasn't quite as much, we're really, really going to miss Karl Anthony Towns, the player, because I think you probably also don't want to just like crap on the guys that are coming in. But I just think that it just speaks to like, to everyone in that locker room, it was more about Karl Anthony Towns, the person first. And everyone in that organization would tell you the same thing. And so for Tibbs, I think it's about connecting with Karl as a dude. But independent of that, I think what you actually might want to look at that could be beneficial from Tibbs' time in Minnesota is like, go look at Karl Anthony Towns' post-up numbers when Tibbs was in Minnesota, because he was one of the best back-to-the-back post-up players, most efficient guys in the league when Tibbs was in Minnesota. And I certainly think that that's something that Tibbs will not have forgotten about. And
I think they were third in the league in offense the 2017-18 season. I'm pretty sure.
I mean, it was a great offense. And I think that will probably come out more, like I was saying. But I think, again, like how much of the two, what's the mix look like? What does the pie look like in terms of the share of Karl Anthony Towns, offensive opportunities, whether that's, shots or basket attacks and kickouts and whatnot. So, but again, like I think obviously being willing to empower your second best offensive player in a lot of different ways, I think is certainly going to be a good olive branch to extend if you're Tibbs, no question about it. But again, I just think it goes so much deeper than basketball for Karl, and I'm just excited for Knicks fans to kind of get to understand all the good that Karl Anthony Towns will do in that community, because to be kind of a cool full circle moment for him to be able to kind of impact some of the communities that impacted him as a kid and all that. So, yeah.
I want to go back to early July, mid-July, when there was initially like I wouldn't even say it was reporting, but it was like Knicks fan TV, CP was like, he had a little report. He was like, the Knicks are definitely interested in Karl Anthony Towns. I think we had DM'd at that time, and you were like, I wouldn't say he's wrong. I'm curious about like, I don't think that Karl Anthony Towns demanded a trade, but I do wonder, and I kind of suspect, if this was a situation where he was like, I'm happy to stay in Minnesota, I like Minnesota, but if there's a trade to be made, like if you're going to move me, and I'm sure look, these guys aren't stupid, especially now. These guys know CBA, they're agents on the CBA, they know the contract situations. Do you think it's fair to say that it might have been a conversation of like, if you're going to move me, I would strongly prefer that you move me to New York?
Yeah, I don't know if those exact conversations happened. It certainly wouldn't surprise me if that took place with Karl. Just when you consider, obviously,
well, you talked about relationships being so important to him. Like, obviously, Leon Rose is there, his former agent, Worldwide West, who I'm sure he has a close relationship with. I don't know if you've listened to Brunson and Hart on their pod, but like, I don't know what it is. They seem to like, they get like really happy when they talk about Karl Anthony Towns, but they don't have any personal relationship that I know of. But it's like, I've always kind of like been like, they get like really excited. They just call him the Big Purr for like 2 minutes and
I see. Part of me just wonder if it's like some inside jokes that,
that's what it
we don't
feels
know
like. Yeah,
about.
yeah,
Now obviously we have like the Mikal Bridges when Carl was doing like this.
yeah.
He's like, too many fingers, my guy. No, but yeah, certainly. I mean, look, Mike Conley. I think I do really think that it is profound and noteworthy that Mike Conley said, and again, this is a direct quote from yesterday at Media Day. From my understanding, they handled it better than probably any organization has ever handled trading somebody, end quote. Like for Mike Conley to say that, like Tim Connolly, he went over to Karl Anthony Towns' house to inform him that he was being traded before this news broke on the
Right.
internet.
Yeah.
So
That's in the Krasinski article.
yeah, and like, so again, I would be shocked if that was the first time that the conversation had been broached. I think obviously the timing of it is a little shocking in terms of it happening right before media day and training camp starting and all that stuff.
And as we know, Shams reported that like the Knicks had made an offer going back to like the draft. So
yeah, and there was reporting that the Timberwolves did their due diligence on potentially trading Karl Anthony Towns
leading up to the draft, right?
Leading up to the draft 2 years or at the 2023 draft, the scoop draft. So like I think the Timberwolves front office has a ton of like stars in it. And they're very proactive and they're going to do their due diligence like any good front office would about making sure that you have a contingency plan, contingency plans for the contingency plans, all this sort of stuff where, again, like when you survey the market and you're like, what's the best possible situation for Karl Anthony Towns? And you'd say, I don't know, when you can play with like an awesome point guard and 3 super long switchable wings that are awesome defenders, like that's probably as good of a, and you can still like go chase a title and you can do it for like the team that you grew up rooting for. Like, yeah, I think that obviously, Karl probably would have wished that it could have ended on better terms, maybe that it wasn't a trade, or maybe it was something where like he left in free agency and whatever. But like, I think in the end, like there's not going to be any bad blood between Karl Anthony Towns and the Timberwolves. And I think he's going to be grateful that, they sent him to a situation where like, he's still going to have a very legitimate shot at winning a championship and being a very consequential player on that team. He's not being sent somewhere to go be like the fourth. It's not like Porzingis in Boston where he's like the fourth banana.
Awful situation.
I know. Well, you know what I mean. Where it's just like
Boston.
You know what I mean. Hey, I've been a white guy in Boston before. I know that, but hey, I mean,
no, like, I know what you mean. Like it's not like they sent him to like Charlotte or something.
No, or it's not like they send him to go play a super reduced role. I guess was more of what I meant by Porzingis, right? Where it's like very different than what you've been used to. So yeah, I would be shocked if the conversation hadn't been had before. Look, Karl's a really smart dude. His agent is a very, high profile agent who's has some big time clients, in her Rolodex. So I would be dumbfounded if there was no conversation that had been had at any point in time that was like, hey, this might happen. And look, Tim Connolly is a guy that really, really values relationships and really values like being open and not sugarcoating things, not beating around the bush, just being a real, just kind of like not just like cards on the table type of guy in terms of how he handles players. And he always talks about how he really wants to, get to know guys and do everything that he can to, make their time playing for the Timberwolves or otherwise better. And there's a reason why, like, you go back and you listen to guys who, played for the Nuggets when Tim Connolly was there and got traded, still talk about how they have great relationships with Tim Connolly. And so I'm sure that they did all those things, but who knows?
Yeah. Also reunited with Gerson Rosas, which is obviously the most important thing. All right. I think that was pretty jam-packed hour and a half here. Jack, thank you so much for joining us. Let people know where they can find you and plug anything that you'd like to plug.
Absolutely. So all my work now is on the Locked On Wolves audio feed. After games, post-game live stream reaction podcast to just about every Timberwolves game this season. Once the regular season gets going, I can also find it on the Locked On Minnesota YouTube channel is where we go live. So Anyone interested in come kick it after any major games on the Wolves schedule or otherwise. Yeah.
Awesome. Jack, thank you so much again for joining us. I have nothing to plug personally, but I will plug all the wonderful work at the Strickland. There's been a deluge of articles in the wake of this blockbuster cat trade. Check those out. Matthew Miranda wrote a great one. Joseph Flynn also wrote a great one. We have some more content coming out tomorrow. And also check out the newest Takes from Obvious Bozos. They dropped a free episode, so check that out and see what you're missing when you're not subscribed to our Patreon. All right, that is our show for today. I hope everybody has a great evening, great week, and I will see you on Friday. Peace.